During the mid-1800s, construction began on a 5-mile tunnel through the Green Mountains of Massachusetts. Almost 200 men died during the construction of the Hoosac Tunnel, which took 25 years to complete. The miners believe the tunnels were haunted by the men who died inside its walls. Miners and visitors describe encounters of unexplained noises, lights, orbs, and apparitions inside the dark, damp, and eerie tunnel. Hi, I'm Mindy. Welcome to the Missing Link channel. Each urban legend and unsolved mystery is just one missing link away from being solved. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a video and help us find that missing link. Let's go back to the early 1800s. There were no cars, no highways, no planes. Transportation of goods was limited to horseback, carriages, stagecoaches, boats, and the railroad. Mountains also caused a huge problem. In 1841, they envisioned a railroad with a tunnel through the mountains. What a huge venture for this time period. There would be a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that would go into a project of this magnitude. The railroad would be able to transport passengers and freight. The tunnel would be about 5 miles in length, 4.74 miles to be exact. The original cost was guesstimated at $2 million and would take 1,556 days, or just over 4 years to complete. The tunnel was going to be 20 feet in height, and the width would range from 23 to 24 feet. Spoiler alert, they were off on the cost and the time it would take to build the tunnel. Construction began on January 8, 1851, and finished over 25 years later in 1875. The final cost was $14 million. That was an unbelievable amount of money back in the 1800s. Construction started at the east side of the mountains in 1852. A 2-man crew would use the device, which was like a chisel with a jack sledgehammer, and make a 2-foot hole. Then another crew would use black powder to make an explosion. On the west side, they had another problem. When an area of rock would be removed, it would quickly fill in with other crumbling rock. They called it porridge rock. In May of 1857, almost 6.5 years since the project started, the tunnel was only 80 feet deep. The east side was coming along a lot faster, 1,810 feet compared to 80 feet. 10 years later, in 1867, the average progress was 80 to 100 feet a month. 20 million bricks were used in the construction of the tunnel. In addition to the tunnel, they had built 4 shafts, which were made from the top of the mountain into the tunnel below. This was for water removal and eventually to remove the smoke from the trains. In 1872, construction was 24/7. They had a large crew with 3 8-hour shifts, with 900 men working in total. Construction went faster as time went on. Equipment and technology improved. New drills were developed, and as time went on, the explosive materials became better as well. Black powder was replaced with nitroglycerin. The first train went through the tunnel on February 9, 1875. The first passenger train went through the tunnel later that year, on October 13, 1875. I found a whole series of videos surrounding the construction of the tunnel that has multiple interviews. For those of you that want more details and stories about the construction itself of the tunnel, I will put a link to the first video below in the description box. Now that we have a history of why the tunnel was being built, let's get into the details of what happened inside the tunnel during construction. The dangers of this type of employment was obvious. Apparently, it was common to see family members crying outside the tunnel, waiting for a family member who was missing, hoping they would appear. They estimate that between 195 to 198 men died during the construction of the tunnel, and at least 30 have died since its completion. However, only 75 of the individuals who died were able to be identified by researchers years later. They were unsure whether the numbers were exaggerated or deaths occurred so often that they weren't always recorded. There were a ton of different ways people died during construction. These deaths included dying from a fall, machinery, drowning, fire, falling rock, explosions, tunnel collapses, and even murder. Some awful and gruesome ways to die. The tunnel became known as the Bloody Pit due to the number of men who died in the tunnel's construction. Some miners even believed that the tunnel was haunted and cursed. Some walked off the job, refusing to go back inside the tunnel. Unfortunately, explosions were common ways to die inside the tunnel. Men would place multiple explosives in an area, maybe as many as 30. After the blast, the only way to find out if they all went off was to check the area where they were placed. Numerous casualties happened when the explosive would detonate with an individual close by. These deaths would obviously be very gruesome. 14 years into the construction of the tunnel, on March 20th, 1865, 3 men were on the explosion crew, working 2 miles inside the tunnel: Ned Brinkman, Billy Nash, and Ringo Kelly. They would plant a charge of nitro and run for the bunker for safety. For some reason, Kelly set the charge early, before the other 2 had reached the safety of the bunker. Brinkman and Nash were buried alive under tons of rock. Some speculated that Kelly did this on purpose. Kelly soon met a strange fate. He disappeared not long after the incident. When he disappeared, people speculated if he did this on purpose, and that's why he was trying to hide. He was found about a year later, on March 30th, 1866. He was in the exact spot where Brinkman and Nash had died the previous year. His cause of death was strangulation, and he had been murdered that day between midnight and 3:30 a.m. What was Kelly doing back inside the tunnel, at the exact spot where Nash and Brinkman died? This murder of Kelly was never solved. Did the spirits of Brinkman and Nash end the life of Kelly? Or did another worker, or perhaps a friend or family member of Brinkman and Nash, take matters into their own hands? 3 years after Nash and Brinkman died in the tunnel, on September 8, 1868, a mechanical engineer named Paul Travers wrote a letter to his sister explaining what he encountered in the tunnel with another worker named Mr. Dunn. Here is exactly what he wrote. The men constantly complain of hearing a man's voice cry out in agony and refuse to enter the great shaft after nightfall. Mr. Dunn has reassured them time and time again that the strange sound is nothing more than the wild winds sweeping down off the mountainside. Our work has been slowed to the point where Mr. Dunn asked me to help him conduct an investigation into the matter. Last night, Mr. Dunn and I entered the Great Tunnel at exactly 9:00 p.m. We traveled about 2 miles into the shaft and then stopped to listen. As we stood there in the cold silence, we both heard what truly sounded like a man groaning out in pain. As you know, I have heard this same sound many times during the war. Yet, when we turned up the wicks on our lamps, there were no other human beings in the shaft, except Mr. Dunn and myself. I'll admit, I haven't been this frightened since Shiloh. Mr. Dunn agreed that it wasn't the wind we heard. Perhaps Nash or Brinkman, I wonder. Just 1 month after this letter was written, another tragedy occurred. They were working on the construction of the central shaft. This shaft was being constructed from the top of the mountain down into the tunnel below. They were trying to build a 1,028-foot vertical shaft, or chimney, for a way to ventilate the tunnel, pump water out, and to eventually remove the exhaust from the trains. This shaft would be even greater in height than the Eiffel Tower. On October 17, 1868, about noon, 13 men descended down the central shaft. They would never return. A building near the top of the central shaft held the explosives. An explosion occurred in the building. 4 men inside tried to put the fire out but couldn't, and they ran for cover, but didn't have a chance to try to get the 13 men inside the shaft just below to safety. The hoist, which lowered the men and equipment into the shaft, were destroyed in the explosion. The 13 men were working underneath the unfinished chimney, which at that time was 583 feet. Equipment, supplies, and the hoist came raining down upon them. The pumps were also destroyed, and the shaft was flooded. Various rescue attempts were made, but they were not able to locate any survivors. One man, named Mallory, was lowered by bucket and rope into the shaft. When he was pulled back up, he could barely breathe because of the fumes, and he said, "No hope." They believed that the 13 men didn't survive the original explosion. Either they died from the falling debris or from asphyxiation. The shaft soon filled with water. A few bodies did surface. This caused another delay in the project. Eventually, construction continued on the shaft. They continued the excavation. Right about a year later, on October 18th, 1868, they made a horrific discovery. They found a makeshift raft that one or more of the 13 men must have made to help with the flooding. They recovered more bodies floating on this raft. The men died from suffocation due to lack of oxygen in the shaft after the fire. While the men were missing, people claimed to hear muffled wails coming from the water-filled shaft. Some people even saw ghostly figures on the mountaintop with what looked like picks and shovels shrouded in mist and snow. People who saw these would look for footprints in the snow, but none were ever found. Once the miners were all located and properly buried, people claim these ghostly figures were not seen any longer, but the moans continued inside the tunnel. 4 years after this tragic accident, in 1872, a man named Dr. Clifford Owens told a newspaper about his experience. Here is his exact statement. On the night of June 25th, 1872, Jane McKinstry and I entered the great excavation at precisely 11:30 p.m. We had traveled about 2 full miles into the shaft when we finally halted for rest. Except for the dim, smoky light cast by our lamps, the place was as cold and dark as a tomb. James and I stood there, talking for a minute or two, and were just about to turn back when suddenly I heard a strange, mournful sound. It was just as if someone or something was suffering great pain. The next thing I saw was a dim light coming along the tunnel from a westerly direction. At first, I believed it was probably a workman with a lantern. Yet, as the light grew closer, it took on a strange blue color and appeared to change shape, almost into the form of a human being without a head. The light seemed to be floating along about a foot or two above the tunnel floor. In the next instant, it felt as if the temperature had suddenly dropped, and a cold, icy chill ran up and down my spine. The headless form came so close that I could have reached out and touched it, but I was too terrified to move. For what seemed like eternity, McKinstry and I just stood there, gaping at the headless thing like two wooden Indians. The blue light remained motionless for a few seconds, as if it were actually looking over us, then floated off towards the east end of the shaft and vanished into thin air. I am above all a realist, nor am I prone to repeating gossip and wild tales that defy a reasonable explanation. However, in all truth, I cannot deny what James McKinstry and I witnessed with our own eyes. 2 years later, October 16th, 1874, Frank Webster was out hunting, but he never returned. He seemed to vanish into thin air. People began searching for him, and 3 days later, they found him along the Deerfield River. Remember, he was gone 3 days. He told the party searching for him that while he was hunting alone, he heard voices that seemed to be telling him to go inside the Hoosac Tunnel. He followed their instructions and headed into the tunnel, where he saw ghostly figures. He had his rifle on him, but somehow, what he described as an invisible hand took it from him and hit him over the head with it. Frank has no idea how he made it out of the tunnel, but his rifle was missing. He also had wounds to his head. He looked like he had been in a fight, maybe a fight for his life. Strange things continued even after the completion of the tunnel. In the fall of 1875, Harlan McVaney was driving a wagon full of firewood through the tunnel one evening. For some reason, not too far inside the tunnel, he turned the horses around and raced out of the tunnel. Days later, the horses and wagon were found 3 miles away, but Harlan was never seen or heard from again. One job I wouldn't want was called a track walker. This man would walk the tracks to make sure everything was clear. One day, there was newly fallen snow on the ground. The track walker walked from the west side to the east side. He then stopped and ate some lunch. Then he continued to walk from the east side to the west side. He was about 2/3 of the way through when he saw a light coming towards him from the west end. This wasn't unusual. As he got closer to the light, he saw 2 forms illuminated by the light. Then it looked like the forms turned around and started heading out of the tunnel. He followed and never saw any footprints in the newly fallen snow. His footprints were visible, but he never could figure out where these forms went if they hadn't left the tunnel. Not all incidents or encounters with these ghosts or spirits were negative. One gentleman, Joseph Impoko, claims that these entities saved his life on more than one occasion. One day he was working for the railroad and was chipping ice off the tracks. He explained in an interview that he heard a voice say, "Run, Joe, run." I turned, and sure enough, there was number 60 coming right at me. Boy, did I jump back fast. When I looked, there was no one there. I heard the voice before I heard the train. Allie Allman, a professor, told a story in 1984. I have been in the tunnel only once, accompanied by a railroad official, and can attest to the claim that it is an eerie place. I had the uncomfortable feeling that someone was walking closely behind me in the darkness and would tap me on my shoulder, or worse, pull me into some unknown and unspeakable horror at any moment. One of his students left a tape recorder in the tunnel, turned it on, and left it there. When they retrieved the tape recorder and pressed play, the sound of muffled human voices could be heard on the tapes. The stories from the tunnels seem to have similarities. It is common for people to see a man wearing old-fashioned work clothes with a white light glowing around the figure of this man. The tunnel officially opened July 1st, 1876. The facade on the outside of the tunnel shows different dates. The east side says 1877, while the west end reads 1874. Instead of stating when the tunnel was actually completed, the dates were from when the facades were completed. So both ends actually have the wrong year. Back in the day, 85 to 90 trains passed through the Hoosac Tunnel every day. At first, it was hard for the railroad crew to breathe while they were inside the tunnel. They had to lie on the floor to find breathable air. Over the years, repairs had to be made to the tunnel, adding lights, adding fans to help with the exhaust smoke, and fixing water leaks. Some of the shafts were increased in size as well. Due to the smoke and darkness, trains even rear-ended each other. People died in these collisions. Back in those days, there was no central agency which controlled railroad traffic to prevent accidents such as these. The Hoosac Tunnel was the longest tunnel in North America until 1916. There is a museum and memorial for the men who died. Everything I read and watched included warnings for everyone to not go in the tunnel or get on the tracks. The trains are still active and hard to hear inside the tunnel. During construction, and even now, the tunnel is definitely a creepy place. It is dark and damp. Water drips from the ceiling and comes down the walls of the tunnel. The tunnel also has deep shadows. Some people have described the Hoosac Tunnel as cold and as dark as a tomb. To this day, chilling wind, shrieking noises, unexplained lights, mysterious orbs, strange mournful sounds, and floating apparitions are reported. The entrances to the tunnel are surrounded by an eerie mist at times. People who dare to go inside say their jackets or shirts seem to be pulled by an entity that can't be seen. They experience whispers in the tunnel, coming from something unknown. I found a video that shows a group of people riding a train through the tunnel. I will put a link in the description box below. It was interesting to see the tunnel from the inside. Portion of the tunnel is brick, and other areas are just plain rock walls. Earlier this year, in February 2020, the tunnel was closed for 2 months for repairs. Apparently, a partial wall collapsed inside. Debris on the tracks made it impossible for trains to continue running. Something similar happened back in 1972, and the tunnel was forced to be closed until repairs were completed. The tunnel is now back open, and 8 trains now go through the tunnel daily. What do you think about the mystery surrounding the Hoosac Tunnel? Would you go inside? Do you think the tunnel is haunted by the men that met an untimely and gruesome death inside its walls? Thank you for joining me here today. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button so I know you enjoy hearing mysterious urban legends and unsolved mysteries. Also, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you'll be notified of my future videos. And follow me on social media as well to see what I am working on next. I still have numerous videos planned for the month of October. As always, have a wonderful day. Watch out for each other and keep looking for that missing link. Love ya, and see you in my next video.